This video covers an important macroeconomic indicator, which is inflation. What is inflation? A simple definition of inflation is a sustained rise in the general level of prices. When prices of most goods and services increase, this implies a higher inflation rate. That is the rate at which the price level increases. Deflation is the opposite of inflation, when we have a sustained decline in the overall prices. You may think of this as negative inflation. How to calculate the inflation rate? Or how do we calculate the general price level? We could do that by calculating the GDP deflator or the consumer price index. Let's talk about these two concepts in more detail. According to the GDP deflator, the price level PT is the nominal GDP denoted by $YT divided by real GDP on that period or in time T. This fraction would give us an index that does not have an economic interpretation by itself, but can help us calculate the inflation rate or the change in the overall price level. The inflation rate would then be PT minus 1 divided by PT minus 1, using GDP deflator to measure the general price level. Instead of using the GDP deflator, we could calculate the general price level using the consumer price index or the CPI. How do we calculate the consumer price index? Imagine you have a basket of goods, and every month you keep a record of how much that basket costs by collecting data on the prices of all items in that basket. Like the GDP deflator, we would be interested here in the change of the basket's cost or the rate of change in the CPI. Again, we could obtain the inflation rate by dividing CPI in time t minus CPI in time t minus 1 divided by CPI in time t minus 1. The CPI data are usually collected every month and based on different cities within the same country. Of course, this might not be the case in many countries where inflation data might not be available monthly. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes inflation data based on price data for 211 items in 28 cities. The UK Office for National Statistics also publishes inflation data monthly. You may want to follow these links on the slides to learn more about which products included in the CPI baskets in the US and the UK. To sum up, inflation is about the sustained rise in the general price level. We could calculate the general price level using the GDP deflator or the CPI. In both cases, the inflation rate is the value of the index this period minus its value last period divided by the previous period. This figure shows the US inflation rate between 1960 and 2014 and calculated based on the GDP deflator, the red line, and the CPI depicted in the blue line. Notice how both are moving together. But why do we care about inflation? Inflation wouldn't receive the same attention had it been a proportional increase in all prices and wages, a pure inflation case. That is a hypothetical case that refers to the case where all prices and nominal values in the economy increasing by the same percent. In the case of pure inflation, it would be only a minor inconvenience because relative prices would be unaffected. Think of real wages as an example to clarify this point further. Real wages are wages measured in terms of goods rather than in pounds. If an inflation rate of 5% meant that prices and salaries increased by 5%, so real wages would be unaffected, inflation would not be a big issue. However, there is no such thing as pure inflation in real life, and policymakers need to keep inflation under control. During periods of inflation, not all prices and wages rise proportionately, and inflation therefore leads to many distortions. In fact, keeping inflation under control reflects sound macroeconomic policy. For example, inflation can affect distribution of income and wealth. During high inflation periods, some people might gain at the cost of others. Those on fixed contractual wages will be affected the most because wages may take some time to catch up with prices. Others, such as sellers who will be able to sell their products at a higher rate, may experience a rise in their income levels. Retired workers in some countries receive payments that do not keep up with the price level, so they lose compared to other groups when inflation is high. Borrowers could benefit at the expense of lenders if the interest rate does not account for unexpectedly high inflation. For firms, variations in relative prices lead to more uncertainty, making it harder for firms to decide on future investment. Another example is how taxation interaction with inflation could create more distortions. If tax brackets are not adjusted for inflation, people may move into higher and higher tax brackets as their nominal income increases, even if their real income remains the same. If inflation is so bad, does this imply that deflation or negative inflation is good? The answer is no. High deflation or a sizable negative inflation rate would create similar problems like high inflation, from distortions to increased uncertainty. A low rate of deflation also limits the ability of monetary policy to affect output. So, what is the best rate of inflation? Most macroeconomists believe that the best inflation rate is a low and stable rate of inflation, somewhere between 1 and 4%. The link on this slide takes you to a page on the Bank of England or the UK Central Bank's website that states a 2% inflation rate target. Before we conclude this video, I would like to refer to an interesting relationship between inflation and unemployment, known as Phillips curve. This relation was first explored in 1958 by a New Zealand economist, Phillips, who plotted the rate of inflation against the unemployment rate as a downward sloped line, implying a negative relationship between both variables. But why that? Remember, Okun's law implies that with healthy enough growth, one can decrease the unemployment rate to shallow levels. But when unemployment becomes very low, the economy is likely to overheat, and this will lead to upward pressure on inflation. This figure plots the change in the inflation rate against the United States unemployment rate since 1960. It suggests higher unemployment leads on average to a decrease in inflation. Lower unemployment leads to an increase in inflation, but this is only true on average. Sometimes high unemployment is associated with an increase in inflation. The fitted line crosses the horizontal axis when the unemployment rate is roughly equal to 6%. When unemployment has been below 6%, inflation has typically increased, suggesting that the economy was overheating or operating above its potential. When unemployment has been above 6%, inflation generally has decreased, suggesting that the economy was operating below its potential. But does this mean that low unemployment is not compatible with low and stable inflation? Do policymakers have the tools to sustain growth to achieve low unemployment while maintaining low inflation? These are the sort of questions we cover in this course when we talk more about different economic policies. As a general rule of thumb, a successful economy is an economy that combines high output growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. To conclude this video, we covered what inflation is and how to measure it using GDP deflator and the CPI. We also discussed the adverse impacts of high inflation rates on individuals and the economy. We then discussed the relationship between inflation and the unemployment rate as depicted in Phillips curve. That's all for this video. See you in the next video.